The pines didn't just block the moon. They seemed to swallow the very idea of light. I had been walking for hours, my boots sinking into the rot of fallen needles, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and something metallic, like old coins. Every snap of a twig felt amplified, a gunshot in a cathedral of silence. I was lost, and the forest knew it. Then the trees broke. In the center of a small, shadowed clearing stood an impossibility. It wasn't a cabin or a ruin. It was a single, jagged slab of gray stone wall, perhaps 10 feet wide, standing perfectly upright without support. Set into its center was a heavy wooden frame holding a pane of glass that shouldn't have been there. It glowed, not with the harshness of a bulb, but with the sickly, flickering amber of a dying hearth. The dread hit me like a physical weight, cold and oily. There was no house behind the wall, just the dark, skeletal reach of the woods, yet the light spilling from the glass suggested a room that didn't exist in this geometry. I took a step closer, my heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird. Inside the window, a figure moved. The glass was frosted with grime, but I could see a man. He was frantic. He was slamming his palms against the glass, his mouth moving in a silent, jagged scream. He looked battered. A dark smear of blood ran down his temple, and his eyes were wide, white circles of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked at me. He didn't just see me, he recognized me. He began to point toward the woods behind me, then beat his fists against the pane again, his movements jerky, like a film skipping frames. There was a sickening half-second delay between his strikes and the muffled thud, thud, thud that echoed through the clearing. The air grew impossibly cold. The silence of the forest curdled into a high-pitched hum that vibrated in my teeth. I felt a gaze on the back of my neck, not from the man, but from the darkness at my back. "Who are you?" I whispered. The man in the window froze. He pressed his face against the glass. The amber light caught his features, and my breath hitched, turning into a sob. It was me. The same mole on the cheek, the same fraying collar of my hiking jacket. But this version of me was broken, his face a mask of desperation I hadn't yet felt. He shook his head violently, his hands splayed against the glass, as if trying to push me away. He wasn't asking for help. He was a warning. Fear turned into a manic, buzzing static in my brain. I reached out. I had to know if he was solid. I had to break the loop. "Stop!" I screamed, though I didn't know if I was yelling at him or the woods. As my fingertips brushed the glass, the temperature plummeted. The man inside, the other me, let out a silent, soul-shredding scream and lunged forward, his fingers clawing at the spot where mine touched. The glass didn't feel like glass. It felt like frozen skin. I pulled back, but my hand stuck. The surface began to ripple. The amber light flared into a blinding, suffocating white. The world tilted. The smell of wet earth was replaced by the suffocating scent of wood smoke and stale blood. Crack! The glass shattered, but no shards fell. Reality simply folded. I gasped, falling forward, but I didn't hit the forest floor. I hit a cold wooden floor. I scrambled up, spinning around, but there were no trees. I was in a room, small, windowless, lit by a single guttering candle, except for one side, the wall, the window. I lunged for the glass, my hands stinging. Outside, framed by the dark, oppressive silhouettes of the pines, stood a man. He looked tired, his jacket slightly frayed, a look of confusion melting into dawning horror on his face. He was stepping closer. He was reaching out. I slammed my palms against the pane, screaming for him to run, to turn back, to look behind him, but no sound left my throat. I saw my own face staring back at me from the darkness, eyes wide with a curiosity that would be my undoing. Again. I pointed at the shadows gathering behind him, the dark shapes I could now see in the trees, things with too many limbs and no faces. He didn't see him. He only saw the window. He reached out.
His finger touched the glass. I felt the cold beginning to take him. I felt the cycle resetting. I pressed my face to the pane, sobbing silently, waiting for the moment the glass would ripple and we would switch places in the dark.
The silence of the Blackwood Preserve isn't an absence of noise, it's a physical weight. It's an oppressive velvet pressure that pushes against your eardrums until they throb. I'd been walking for 6 hours, the beam of my flashlight dying a slow, flickering death, leaving me with nothing but the bruised silver of a waning moon filtering through the skeletal canopy. I stopped to adjust my pack. Crunch. The sound of a heavy boot hitting dried pine needles echoed through the clearing. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. But the sound hadn't come after I moved. My foot was still hovering an inch above the ground. I frowned, shaking my head. Dehydration does strange things to the senses. I lowered my foot, completing the step. This time, there was no sound at all. I took another step. Crunch. Again, the sound preceded the action. It was a rhythmic, deliberate noise, exactly the weight of my own body, occurring a fraction of a second before my muscles even began to contract. It was as if the forest was impatient, playing the soundtrack of my journey at a slightly faster speed than I was living it. I stopped dead. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. The forest held its breath with me. The shadows between the hemlocks seemed to lean in, thick and ink-black, watching. I waited a full minute, my eyes searching for a source, a prankster, a predator, anything logical. There was only the shifting of the moonlight and the feeling that the darkness was a living, breathing membrane. I decided to test it. I lunged to the left. Scuff. My body followed the sound, my left leg swinging out to catch my weight. I hadn't even consciously decided to move left until the sound demanded it. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through my gut. I tried to turn back toward the trailhead, but as I began to pivot, a loud, wet snap of a twig sounded behind me. My body didn't turn. Instead, my torso twisted with a violent, involuntary jerk following the acoustic lead. My joints popped with the suddenness of the motion. I wasn't moving anymore. I was being pulled by my own ears. The forest began to change. The trees didn't look like wood and bark. They looked like jagged, frozen lightning bolts reaching for the sky. The silence was gone, replaced by a low, sub-audible hum that vibrated in my teeth. I tried to scream, but a sharp gasp sounded in the air in front of my face first. My lungs expanded against my will, sucking in the cold, pine-scented air to fill the space the sound had created. I was a marionette, and the strings were made of vibrations. I tried to fight it. I willed my legs to stay still, digging my heels into the mulch. I clenched my fists until my nails drew blood. I stared at a twisted oak 20 yards away, promising myself I wouldn't move an inch. Thump, thump, thump. The sounds of running. My legs snapped upward. My knees hit my chest as I was propelled forward into a sprint. I wasn't running. I was falling into the noise. Each footfall was preceded by that sickeningly familiar crunch, a split second of auditory prophecy that my muscles were forced to fulfill. I hurtled through the brush, branches tearing at my jacket, my eyes wide and streaming tears I hadn't authorized. I saw the glint of metal through the trees, my car, the gravel shoulder of the logging road. Safety. The thought flashed through my mind, but it felt hollow. As I neared the edge of the woods, the sounds became frantic. Scrape, slam, thud. My body mimicked them with agonizing precision. I scrambled over the final embankment, my hands hitting the gravel before I even knew I was falling. I crawled toward the driver's side door, my breath coming in ragged bursts that always started a heartbeat before my chest heaved.
I reached the door. Clink. My hand shot out, grasping the handle. I yanked it open, dived inside, and slammed the door shut. The locks clicked into place. I sat there in the dark cabin, the dashboard glowing with a dim, ghostly green light. I was safe. I was behind glass and steel. I sat perfectly still, waiting for my heart to slow. I stared out the windshield at the wall of trees I had just escaped. They stood motionless, a silent audience to my terrors. I decided to reach for the ignition. I stopped. I froze my hand halfway to the steering wheel. I would stay here. I would stay here until the sun came up. I would not move. In the absolute suffocating silence of the car, a sound erupted. Jingle. The keys in the ignition turned. My hand was still in my lap. Vroom. The engine roared to life, the vibration rattling my spine. My foot hadn't touched the gas. Then, the most terrifying sound of all. A soft, wet, rhythmic thump-thump, thump-thump, coming from the empty passenger seat. It was the sound of a heartbeat. And as I felt my own heart stutter and then forcefully align its rhythm to that external pulse, I realized the horror wasn't that something was following me. It was that I was no longer living my life. I was just the echo. The car shifted into gear. I watched my own hands grip the wheel and turn it toward the dark, endless road, following the sound of the tires that had already begun to play in the air.
The silence in the woods isn't empty. It's heavy. It's the kind of silence that has weight, pressing against the windows of this cabin until the glass feels like it might shatter. I was sitting by the dying embers of the hearth, a book forgotten in my lap, watching the shadows stretch across the floorboards. Then it happened. Thump. A single, deliberate knock on the front door. Not the frantic rapping of a traveler lost in the dark, nor the rhythmic greeting of a friend. Just one. I waited, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. I peered through the peephole into the oppressive ink of the porch. Nothing. The motion sensor light hadn't even triggered. I chalked it up to a heavy branch or the house settling in the frost, though deep down I knew wood didn't sound like bone on oak. 20 minutes passed. The dread had just begun to recede when it returned. Thump. This time it was the kitchen door at the back. I ran, my socks sliding on the hardwood. I ripped the door open, expecting a prankster, a neighbor, anyone. There was only the tree line, a wall of jagged black pines against a gray-black sky. The air that rushed in was unnaturally cold, smelling of wet earth and something ancient, like a tomb newly opened. I locked the door, my breath hitching. I realized then that the woods had gone completely silent. No crickets, no wind, just a suffocating stillness that made my ears ring. Thump. The sound came from the frosted glass of the bathroom window. I didn't even go to look. I stood in the hallway, paralyzed. My mind began to race, trying to find a pattern in the chaos. Front door, back door, window. It was circling. No, it wasn't circling. It was testing. The lights flickered, the warm yellow glow of the lamps dying down to a sickly, jaundiced dimness. The temperature in the hallway plummeted. I could see my breath now, a ghostly mist blooming in front of my face. That's when the realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. It never knocked twice on the same surface. It didn't need to. Whatever was out there, it wasn't trying to be let in. The knock wasn't a request. It was a notification. One knock per barrier. And once the sound was made, the barrier was gone. Thump.
The sound echoed off the wood-paneled wall of the living room. Not a door, not a window, but the solid structural perimeter of the house. I backed away, my eyes wide, watching the spot where the sound had originated. The wallpaper seemed to bruise, a faint dark shadow bleeding through the pattern, though nothing physical broke the surface. It was inside the walls now. I retreated into the bedroom, slamming the door and shoving the heavy dresser against it. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grip my phone. No signal, of course. The silence in the house was now so thick it felt like breathing water. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the bedroom door. Thump. The wood of the door groaned. The dresser didn't move an inch, but I felt a shift in the room. The air behind me grew dense. The smell of wet earth was no longer coming from the outside. It was rising from the floorboards, from the bedding, from the very air I was inhaling. I didn't want to turn around. I knew with a primal certainty that if I turned around, the logic of the world would cease to function. I felt a gaze, not a pair of eyes, but a vast, cold consciousness pressed against the back of my neck. It felt like standing on the edge of a bottomless trench in the ocean. I squeezed my eyes shut, burying my face in my hands. "Please," I whispered, "please." The silence stretched for what felt like hours. My muscles ached from the tension. I began to hope. Maybe it was over. Maybe the bedroom was the final stop. Maybe the once rule meant it was satisfied. Then the final barrier broke. Thump. The sound didn't come from the door. It didn't come from the walls or the floor. It resonated from the base of my skull, a dull, wet vibration that rattled my teeth. It was a knock from behind my eyes, inside the vault of my own bone. I tried to scream, but my throat felt filled with cold, damp soil. I wasn't alone in my head anymore. Something else was folding itself into the corners of my mind, settling in the spaces between my thoughts. I reached out to switch off the bedside lamp, but my hand didn't obey me. It moved with a slow, mechanical grace I didn't possess. I watched, a passenger in my own skin, as my fingers gripped the switch. The light clicked off. In the total darkness of the room, I heard it one last time. Not a sound in the air, but a thought that wasn't mine, echoing against the back of my forehead. Thump.
The forest didn't just feel dark. It felt heavy. The air was thick with the scent of damp pine and rot, a stagnant weight that pressed against my lungs as I approached the mouth of the ravine bridge. It was a skeletal structure of graying timber and rusted bolts, stretching nearly 50 yards over a black, bottomless gorge. I shouldn't have been there at 2 a.m., but the shortcut through the woods was the only way home, and the silence of the trees was better than the exposure of the main road, or so I told myself. I took my first step onto the wood. Thump. A beat later, a second sound followed. Thump. I paused. The echo was sharp, metallic. I figured it was the hollow belly of the ravine playing tricks with acoustics. I took another step. Thump, thump. Then 3 more in quick succession. Thump, 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 thump. It was rhythmic, almost melodic. My brain, desperate for a rational explanation, settled on the bridge's age. The boards were loose. The vibration of my weight must have been triggering a secondary rattle in the supports further down the line. I kept walking, my eyes fixed on the far bank, where the tree line looked like a wall of jagged obsidian. The wind died down completely. The forest became an absolute vacuum of sound, leaving only me and the wood beneath my boots.
That's when the rhythm broke. I took a long, purposeful stride. Thump. I waited for the echo. It didn't come. Instead, there was a silence that lasted 3 full seconds, long enough for my heart to hammer against my ribs, and then a heavy, deliberate crunch of wood directly behind me. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat, coming out in a silver plume of mist. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The silence returned, deeper than before, as if the forest was holding its breath to see what I would do next. I took a small, tentative step. Thump. Behind me, a fraction of a second later, thump. I took 2 fast steps. Thump, thump. The response was 3 steps. Thump, thump, thump. The third step was louder, heavier, as if whoever or whatever was behind me had shorter legs but a much greater mass. My skin crawled. The hair on my arms stood up, reacting to a sudden drop in temperature that felt like stepping into a meat locker. "Hello?" I whispered. The word was swallowed by the dark. I decided to test it. I took 5 rapid, uneven steps, staccato like a drum roll, and then stopped dead. Thump, 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 thump. I stood perfectly still. My pulse was a frantic rhythm in my ears. For 5 seconds, there was nothing. Then, the wood directly to my left creaked. Not behind me, beside me. Something was standing in the empty space between the handrail and my shoulder. I could feel the displacement of air, a cold pressure that suggested something tall and spindly was looming over me. Then the footsteps started again, but I wasn't moving. Thump, thump, thump. The sound began to circle me. The boards groaned under an invisible weight, tracing a slow, predatory perimeter around my body. I squeezed my eyes shut, my hands gripping the freezing iron guide wire until my knuckles went white. The footsteps were no longer just echoes. They were physical strikes against the wood that I could feel in the soles of my feet. The pacing stopped directly in front of me. I opened my eyes, staring into the darkness of the bridge ahead. There was nothing there, just the vanishing point of the wooden slats. I tried to take a step backward, to retreat to the safety of the shore I'd left behind. My leg wouldn't move. It wasn't paralysis, it was resistance. I felt a cold, phantom pressure against my shin, pushing back. I tried to lift my right foot, and my body jerked forward instead. My foot slammed down a foot ahead of where I intended. Thump. A wave of nausea hit me. I wasn't walking anymore. I was being moved. Every time I tried to shift my weight, the invisible force guided my limbs. It was like being a marionette on rusted wires. If I tried to stop, a sharp, invisible force would shove my shoulder, forcing me to take another step to keep my balance. Thump, thump, thump. It was halfway across now. The echo had changed. It was no longer following me. It was leading the way, hitting the boards a millisecond before my own feet were forced down. The entity was counting the steps, and I was merely the shadow following its lead. "Please," I choked out, but my jaw felt tight, as if invisible fingers were hovering near my throat. The pace quickened. We were nearly the end of the bridge. The final 10 yards felt like an eternity. My legs were moving in a frantic, unnatural gait, a distorted double-time march. The wood screamed under the dual pressure. I reached the threshold where the wood met the dirt of the far bank, and with a final violent shove, I was propelled off the bridge and onto the solid earth. I spun around, my flashlight, which I hadn't realized I was clutching so hard, flicking onto the bridge. The bridge was empty, the silvered wood showing nothing but the ancient, weathered planks. I stood there, gasping for air, waiting for a monster to leap from the shadows or a ghost to manifest in the mist. Nothing happened. I let out a sob of relief, a jagged sound that tore through the silence. Just the wind, I lied to the trees. Just a panic attack. Just physics. I turned away from the bridge and began to walk down the forest path towards the lights of the town in the distance. I took one step onto the gravel. Crunch. And then, from the air right behind my left ear, came the second sound. Crunch. I stopped. I didn't breathe. I didn't move a muscle. 1 second passed. 2, 3. Then, without me moving at all, a third footstep hit the gravel. Crunch. It was closer now. It wasn't on the bridge anymore. It had followed me off the bridge. It was standing in my shadow, waiting for me to start the count again. I realized then that the bridge hadn't been the trap. The bridge was the introduction. I began to walk again, faster this time, tears blurring my vision, and with every single step I took, the extra beat followed, a loyal, invisible companion, perfectly in sync, counting my life down, one footfall at a time.